Now we're about to go to Freetown, Sierra Leone. Freetown is important because it shows a history of the return of some of these enslaved Africans from the past. 4 of them. 1787, the Black War came. 1792, the Nova Scotians came. 1800, the Jamaican Maroons. And then after 1807, the largest population that came to Sierra Leone were the Liberated Africans.
So I feel like the Americans have received a great treatment in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leoneans, we are a very friendly people. We're very tolerating and accommodating, and I think having visitors in our land, we have gone above and beyond to make them feel welcome. With us just going to each other's homes as a people, we're very welcoming. So when we have people coming from across the seas, just to come visit and to trace their roots, we have received them as our brothers and sisters because they are brothers and sisters. We're separated by land, we're separated through time because of various reasons. Primarily the transatlantic slave trade, which our trip is highlighting, from the slavery to resistance to abolition, and so it's been very important. I feel like they've been welcomed pretty well.
(1791, 1792), about 1,000 plus African Americans that came from the Chesapeake region and the Charleston region. Pretty much they fought for the British during the American Revolutionary War. They fought on the side of the British, and because of that they were granted freedom. So eventually they settled in Nova Scotia after the war ended because they had to leave. So they stayed in Nova Scotia for about 10 years. And because of that, they're usually called the Nova Scotians. So a lot of people don't necessarily attribute African American to them because they just think they're from Nova Scotia, but they were actually African Americans. Eventually, they didn't want to stay in Nova Scotia, so eventually they came down into Freetown, or they came to Sierra Leone. They signed petitions. They were led by a gentleman called Thomas Peters. He was a Yoruba, but he was enslaved in America, in North Carolina, and he actually ran away and went over to the British. You had other people like David George, who was born in Virginia, fled down to Georgia and founded one of the first Baptist congregations in America for blacks. You had people like Boston King, who was born in I believe Charleston, South Carolina. You had others, many others. You had John Gordon, who was actually born here and was taken as a slave there, and went through the whole Nova Scotian route and eventually came back here by chance. Like he didn't know he was coming back. But pretty much 1792, in March, 1,000 and about 100 and something of them eventually came on 15 ships and landed right, that water over there. They landed there and came on to this place. Now, I believe that's the cotton tree that you can see right there. But that cotton tree was where they first, as soon as they landed, they went to the cotton tree. There was this huge tree there. All of this were bushes. Nothing was here. So they went up to that tree and said a prayer at the base of the tree. And it was led by David George, the guy who I just said was born in Virginia. So eventually, over the next few months, the British was the one that obviously was facilitating their settlement, but they started building their homes. They were given land lots across this whole area, and they started developing the city. They developed about 9 streets at 90-degree angles, and they named some of them after the board of directors of the company that was sponsoring this trip, called the Sierra Leone Company. It was made up of a bunch of British philanthropists, people like Granville Sharp, William Wilberforce, and a couple others who they usually call them the Clapham sect, because a lot of them came from an area called Clapham in London. So they came here and they made 19 streets. This was one of them, so practically on this street and the parallel streets. So 9 streets, you have I think about 5 or 6 parallel to each other, and then you have cross streets that make the 90-degree angle also parallel to each other. And in that region is pretty much, the small town is where they all settled. We also had East Street, which was over that way. You had people like Paul Coffey, who was from Massachusetts. He was actually the one that spearheaded the American Colonization Society that started, transporting African Americans to what would eventually become Liberia. So Paul Coffey from Massachusetts, he wasn't part of the group. He actually lived in Massachusetts. He was actually one of the only mariners in those times. He actually had his own ship that he would take from Massachusetts all the way to Sierra Leone. He would take it to London, and all of the crew members on his ship were black. I mean, that's amazing in late 1700s for that to be the case. I mean, in those days, in the late 1800s, you're thinking in America we have slavery just ended, Reconstruction era just beginning in the 1860s and 70s. Right on these streets, lawyers, barristers, doctors, at the same time. At the same time, streets of Sierra Leone, Freetown. So you can imagine the level of importance and value that an African American would have coming to just this town, settler town. We know as far as Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, but they were late 1800s. This gives you an entire century, really, 100 years of history and accomplishment by black folks who pretty much rose up to become equals with anyone in the world. It would have been around here that the freed slaves would have come on board when they came into Freetown. And then also, now another element to think about as well before we get back to those are the people they call the recaptives. The recaptives, the liberated Africans. So pretty much the first set of ancestors of the Creoles of Freetown are the Black Loyalists, the Black Americans that came in 1792, and also some had come before in 1787, but they were pretty much the same group. But the second group that came in were the Maroons from Jamaica. About 500 to 600 of them came. They also had been in Jamaica, obviously. They were one of the different groups of Maroons in Jamaica that had fought the British there and won. And they lived in the Blue Mountains. They were the Trelawney Maroons. They lived in the Blue Mountains, different from the regular Jamaican because they intermingled and interbred with the Native Americans or the Native Indigenous people. In 1815, you had neighbors from distant lands together. So you can imagine that in 1815, you had a town, this town that had African Americans, half of those from the southern part of America, half of those from the northern part of America. That in itself is different. And then you have the Maroons from Jamaica, from the Blue Mountains of Jamaica. You got all of them in one town. That the dynamics of that, it always fascinates me because I can't imagine what that would have been like as far as the language, the communication, the traditions, the culture, the freedom that they're coming from. You know, the traditions, the customs that they bring in. Each of them would have preserved their own set of custom and traditions from their own backgrounds. The Maroons from Jamaica, and you know, Akan, the Black Loyalists from Nova Scotia, all the way to, you know, the Chesapeake and Charleston and places like that, all coming together and harnessing. So that was essentially the first start of what we call the Creole people. Now, the third major group that came into effect were called the recaptives, the liberated Africans. In 1807, the British pretty much decided to abolish slavery. Now, mind you, it's not the same as the Americans who abolished slavery in 1860s. The British abolished slavery in 1807. This was where they stationed. You know, slavery was still going on, pretty much, even though they abolished it. But they pretty much got into, they developed policies where they would go into the seas, into the Atlantic Ocean, and seize any ship that was illegally transporting slaves. And when they seized those ships, they would seize all the products on board of those ships, including the slaves. So essentially what they ended up doing was they started creating different satellite locations. The main one was based here in Freetown. They also had one in Havana, Cuba. They had one in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. They had one in, I believe, Barbados, the Bahamas, I think. So what they would do is they would take these slaves that they've now liberated, hence the name Liberated African, or they recaptured these slaves, hence the name recaptured. Now for the Freetown, they had a place called the Liberation Yard, the Liberated African Yard. You had the Liberated African Department, which is where they would take these people in, process them, and so forth. That was around here. I think that's where they're at right now, I believe. But this is where they would bring them in and essentially process them, and then, you know, take them to wherever they would settle. Now, in essence, between, I think, 1807 and the 1870s, at least 70,000, I believe, were processed and resettled here. 70,000. So when you take 1,000 plus Black Americans, you take about 500 Jamaicans, and then you take 70,000 West Africans, West and Central Africans, people from all the way from Cameroon to Angola, South Africa, Cape Town, all the way to Gambia, Nigeria, all the way down to Guinea-Bissau, Fernando Po, all the way up to Senegal. Like, it was amazing that you had all of these people coming here, but they wouldn't necessarily be brought into settler town because there was essentially, you know, a huge class gap, because the settlers had a very unique characteristic to them that they came with. Essentially, these were leaders. These were Black leaders. These were leaders in the military that they served while in America. You know, these were religious people, extremely religious people that essentially started some of the first religious congregations, denominations in America for Blacks. So they had a very unique and tight-knit community that they did not want intermarrying into. And then you also had the Maroons, who also were warlike people themselves, and they had their own pride to deal with. They didn't want to mix, you know, but essentially they ended up mixing, but they looked down on these recaptives as the way, I guess, others are looked down now. You know, they did not clothes on, things like that. You know, they seemed primitive and savage according to whoever's definition you're looking at. So these captives were actually sent out into the outskirts of settler town. And this is how you get the rest of Freetown. The rest of Freetown, like the peninsula that we call the mountain villages. You would have, like, because there were so many people, like for example in the 40s or so, a German linguist called Coel, he worked in Freetown, and he documented about 100 different languages in a town of about 100,000 people. 100 different African languages in a town of about 100,000 people. So the other manifestation of that is where these people lived. Towns and villages were created for specific groups of ethnicities. So you have places now that's still here that was called Congo Town, that were a lot of the people from the Congo that went there and settled there. So they congregated based on their language groups and ethnicity and customs. You have Portuguese Town, which were a lot of people from, like, you know, Fernando Po and Portuguese areas who spoke Portuguese for the most part. You had in those days you had Igbo Town. You had Igbo Town. You had where a lot of the Igbos came together. You had places like Town, all the way down towards where the hotel is by the water. The Town was where a lot of Egbados from Nigeria settled. You had Waterloo village. You had regions. You had regions. You had Wellington. You had Kissy. So all of these villages pretty much sprang up, and essentially that's where a lot of the recaptives, you know, were settled. And essentially all those different groups practically became the ancestors of the Creole people of Freetown.
Your coming is like you searching for a strong connection back home, like a distance relative. So it means a lot, and there are a lot of things that people can benefit here when it comes to tourism. When you look at the hills and the valley, I think this is the only place you can find with natural beauty. When you talk about the sea and the city, you have the rivers in the city, the hill is up there, the valley is down there. So, and it's by nature. No one built it, so that's unique. You go to the beaches and so on and so forth. So for me, your coming means a lot. You know, like meeting our brothers, meeting our sisters, you know, for the first time in our own generation. So to me, it means a lot.
I didn't expect, when Amadou told us about all the people who would be helping out and supporting us, I didn't know it was going to be people our age. I didn't know it was going to be friends and brothers and sisters in this way. And to think that our ancestors thought about us, and they planned for us, and they made choices with the intentions that we would be here and we would connect and we would find each other again one day is really, really powerful.
For me personally, and including Amadou, we did this mainly to fulfill our commitment to our kinfolks that we've been meeting in South Carolina, in Atlanta. Amadou, for example, knows 90% of the team that came here in person at a personal level. In terms of the logistics, for example, we knew we are coming from America, and we know the medical situation in Sierra Leone is not the greatest. So on our team, we have a board-certified medical doctor who is traveling with us. So in case anyone have some issues from a medical standpoint, the doctor takes care of that person. We also made sure that we had medical insurance for every one of the team coming. That includes even evacuation in cases of emergency, because we didn't want to take any risks. The average age of the participants is 55, so we were conscious of that, so we wanted to make sure that all of those things are put in place from a logistics standpoint. In terms of vehicles, we have 2 big buses. Each one of them can take about 20 people conveniently, and we have 2 smaller buses. Each one can take about 14 people again conveniently. So these 2 buses can take all of the participants together with our volunteers to travel all over the country. Where there is a need to add more, we have 2 other buses on standby that we can call, and they can meet us wherever within an hour or within 2 hours. All the drivers are with us 24 hours. The volunteer students that we have that are studying tourism are with us also 24 hours. Myself and Amadou, we are within the hotel where the participants are lodging 24 hours around the clock. And so far, I will say it's been great. It's a huge undertaking to travel around the country with 40 plus people, with the average age being 55. But I think we can do it again. So food and other logistics. So for example, Wi-Fi. We know everyone needs the internet, everyone needs to communicate to their families. So we purchase wireless modems and put some SIM cards and data inside. So each one of the buses at the minimum have these modems in, and these modems will work across the country. So everyone can connect and talk to their family on the go and also share pictures. We did all that in Sierra Leone here. Myself, I'm a management consultant and an IT professional. So with that background in the IT and management company that we have in Sierra Leone, we're able to do those logistics from an IT standpoint. Water, food on the go, a little challenging, but we managed to work that out. We did preparations in advance, lunch to go in the box. Wherever we're going, we'll make arrangements with one of the local restaurants. They will prepare all the food, we pay them in advance, we pick it up to make sure that we have the food with us when we need it. Even when we are in the village or in the bush somewhere where you cannot find any food to buy, we make sure we have food with us. Water, we are always buying enough water, buying ice. We bought cool mans to make sure that we can keep the water cold. Whenever somebody needs water, we'll make it available. The buses will have the water inside. So it's, again, challenging, but we were able to overcome it because we have team members with us that are able to help, and we are just dividing and conquering. Everybody else doing their own piece, and then we bring in everything together.